Hello and welcome to This is the Way. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin T. Wald. This podcast episode is sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. Okay, Richard, so finally, it seems to me in some ways incredible that it's taken this long. We're going to have an episode on Confucianism and ritual. And as I see it, this is such a vast, complex, and important topic that there are a number of ways there are a number of ways that we could sort of slice and dice this issue and kind of analyze it. But we're going to do it this time, at least, by looking at a really provocative, interesting claim in Analects 317 that essentially seems to suggest that Kongzi thinks traditional rituals are something that should continue to be practiced because, well, for whatever reason, it's not entirely clear, but he seems to be quite adamant about not letting go of the traditional rituals, even when other members of the community are no longer giving them their due, no longer really paying attention to the ritual, or no longer seeing the ritual as having much significance or meaning. So we're going to kind of go straight for the heart of the matter and look at Kongzi as a traditionalist, at least one passage that really presents Kongzi as a kind of strong traditionalist about ritual practice. And this reminds me that ritual is, since it's seen as such an important part of Confucian thought, this is one of the many reasons why you will often find scholars of Confucianism in religious studies departments, because it turns out that Confucian philosophers were pretty sophisticated thinkers about ritual in general, which aligns rather nicely with disciplinary approaches to the study of religion these days. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, stop me if you think this is a bad idea, Richard, or if it's too private or something. But recently I've been getting feedback from listeners, including Martin, someone from Poland, I believe, that makes me think people actually want to know a little bit more about us and how much we sort of adopt and take on board these philosophical ideas. In order to fill out that picture, I am suspecting that a lot of them would like to know what our kind of religious, spiritual views are. So if it's all right with you, I thought maybe we could, obviously we don't want to give a religious autobiography or a spiritual autobiography for ourselves. That's too much. But we should at least kind of maybe say where we're coming from, as the expression sometimes goes, spiritually or religiously speaking. So if you're comfortable, I'll say what I think is well known about you, which is that you are now a practicing Catholic. Like a lot of philosophers who practices Catholicism, you have very interesting views about the nature of religious belief and the reasons to be religious, both as a practitioner and as a believer. And I'm sure you have an interesting backstory too. So I wonder if we could hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't think I tend to speak too much about this, and hopefully it won't be too boring. But I really don't mind sharing. Yeah, so of course, philosophers don't tend to be religious. In fact, you can find the data. Most philosophers tend to be more atheistic in their worldview, but not all, of course. And there's some very prominent philosophers who are religious and Catholic or belong to some other religious tradition. For example, like Elizabeth Anscombe obviously comes to mind,
Yes.
and people like Charles Taylor, Alistair MacIntyre. So there's some really hard-hitting philosophers who are also very deeply religious.
Yeah.
Interestingly, so I grew up in kind of a loosey Catholic background, like kind of Catholic Confucian household. I remember in middle school, I just became so skeptical. I was like, like Bible seems so old. Why are we, why do we read it? And I remember asking my parents that, and I don't remember them giving me very good answers. And sometimes we would go to church. My dad was always kind of a skeptic. He's a kind of, even today, I mean, the funny thing is they go to church, but my dad the way he describes it is he just goes there and comes back. Like, I don't even quite understand exactly his commitments. My mom's more, I guess, devout. But when I was growing up, they weren't so pushy. And then like in high school, I just stopped going to church and consider myself like a rational atheist. And I was always, at that time, even more so than today, I was more obnoxious and kind of combative. And
Really?
my best friend was this pastor's kid. And he was a Korean, he belonged to this Korean Protestant church. And I remember arguing and, raising these objections. And he didn't really like arguing. So, I was pretty annoying, I'm sure. And the thing is, I asked him about it way later when I did become religious myself. And he was like, yeah, you were so obnoxious, Richard. I could barely stand it.
Really? I have a hard time imagining that, Richard.
Oh, no, it's no, it's true, though. Yeah, but at the very end of high school, I'm not going to go into all the details, but I had this kind of more of a moral experience where I thought, wow, I really started to think I'm like not a very good person. So my kind of first step into kind of a spiritual journey, if we call that, would be I really wanted to become a better human being. So
Hmm.
at the end of high school, I started volunteering. This was right before I started college. And I was started volunteering at this youth shelter
Mm.
in Southern California, still there, Casa Youth Shelter. And I remember one day as I was volunteering, they asked me to take these bags of clothes to what they called the Catholic workers. And I
Mm.
didn't know what the Catholic workers were, but it was in Santa Ana. It's called the Isaiah House. I'm pretty sure it's there. I haven't been there for like a long time. But I took the clothes there, and it's just this large house, which was started by these two people who are in the corporate world, like they're married, and they
Mm.
just gave it all up. They were disillusioned by it, and they were very serious Catholics. But what they do is every single day they would just take in anybody who wanted to stay overnight. So every
Mm.
single night they would have like 120, 130 people, children, just people who didn't have a
Wow.
place to stay. It was incredible. And I just started going there and I started talking to them. And then they got me onto a Dorothy Day. So she's the founder of the Catholic
Mm.
worker
Hmm.
movement. And I read her book, The Long Loneliness by Dorothy Day. That book was transformative, and I read her other writings. And well, so like just to say one more thing, I was really put off to religion and Christianity, especially in high school, because I really got annoyed by these kind of evangelicals. I think that's a experience that some people have. But of course, I didn't really bother to like read the better stuff or listen to the better arguments or
Yeah.
explanations. But Dorothy Day captured this idea that you can integrate a serious religious worldview together with practice. So what she was doing was she was living with the poor, and she devoted her life in that way. But she also was like a daily mass goer and prayed the rosary. And she kind of saw it all as interconnected. Like you need the spiritual life. You need to kind of deeply receive like the love of God so that it can be manifested in all of your actions. And through prayer, you gain more of that kind of what we would call grace. And it sort of transforms you over time. And so I
Mm.
just thought like that vision of where it was both practical, theoretical, and kind of metaphysical, that picture that was presented to me through Dorothy Day's words. And she was a beautiful writer too. I just found to be so attractive. And so when I started college, I started going to the Catholic workers in LA. This is they have a place in Skid Row, which I think
Mm.
has the most homeless people probably in the world, or I don't know, at least in America, I guess I should say.
Yeah.
So I would serve soup there, and so that experience really transformed me. But I didn't quite have the metaphysical view that God exists quite yet. But I also got involved with this Korean American Catholic group, which was the only Catholic group that was on campus. And so
Mm.
I met some very good people, very smart people, really good people. So I started just going, and I remember just going to mass every Sunday. And then I don't think it was because I started studying philosophy and got good arguments, but I just realized the practice, the desire to become good, and that view, at least the way I understood it, didn't have the kind of the proper anchoring or sense without the more theoretical beliefs and the
Mm.
acceptance of like that kind of worldview, at least for me. So then I just started praying to have faith. And I don't know, it's always a kind of journey. I never had a mystical experience that kind of moved me toward faith, but I think like I studied enough arguments as a philosopher where I don't think that they're these knockdown arguments that just would compel like a non-believer or something like that. But in the other direction, I think there are some rational arguments that at least also show that there are reasons for your belief. And then faith, I think, happens where there's a little bit of a leap,
Hmm.
just like trusting a person, right? I mean, do we trust someone we
Hmm.
love exactly and only to the point to which we have exact amount of evidence and reasons? I mean, that just seems like such a cold, calculative way of living. And I don't even
Yeah.
think that's how the human spirit operates. And so I think that's kind of the way I've thought about it. Yeah. So, anyways, and then I just kept going. There are times when like my faith is kind of weak, but I just kept going to church, and then it just shaped me, and I try to live as a Catholic the best I can. I mean, what's interesting is I remember being in the philosophy club at UCLA, and then like I was the only person who was religious, and then they found out, and they thought of me as like, oh yeah, he's sharp, or he knows philosophy. But then they were like blown away that I actually believe in God because they were all like atheists in that club. And they were like, what? Like, how could you possibly believe in in these things and like miracles and the supernatural, which I kind of understand. Like when you're in the framework of pure materialism, physicalism, or naturalism, it just seems so irrational to believe that there's any event that's not reducible to maybe like a material event.
Hmm.
But if you don't accept that starting point, if you do think that God exists, and then you could still hold to a lot of science. Like, by the way, I love science and I, I study
Yes.
psychology. I mean, anyone who's read my work, I'm very interdisciplinary. But like for me, like, yeah, so I don't accept that pure materialist standpoint, but because I think God exists and that there's a spiritual realm. But I think God created the world to be intelligible. And so that's why science is possible. That's why mathematics happens to correspond to reality and why human minds and intellect are able to grasp reality and all those things which I marvel at all the time. To me, I guess, and I don't mean this to be, again, a compelling argument, but it seems to also make sense within a theistic paradigm. So, from that direction, I guess I'll have more problems like making sense of like, oh, how do you explain miracles? Which, legitimate question. And I don't
Hmm.
necessarily have like an exact answer. But on the other hand, there's also this question of, well, why is the world intelligible in this way? Why do we have these rational intellects that are able to grasp the world and make
Hmm.
sense and do science at all instead of just blowing up into pieces or something like that? Why are there these laws of nature? So, anyways, those are like kind of sketchy arguments. But yeah, so
Yeah.
anyway, all that's to say, yeah, that's kind of the basic. I mean, we can go on for hours, obviously, and this is a kind of a narrative reconstruction that probably is flawed in many ways, but that's the basic gist of it. Yeah. So let me stop there because I don't want to keep going on. And I
Oh,
would also
okay.
love to hear about your biography there, Justin, because yeah, I'm
Yeah.
very curious.
Well, it's not as interesting, but I should disclose it just for the sake of, kind of laying all my cards on the table. But before I do that, let me just say that's a fascinating story. I didn't know about your work with the Catholic workers and reading day. That's fascinating. It also comports, Richard. So, like, it's consistent with everything I know about you. The first time that we met, I thought, wow, I've been talking about philosophy basically nonstop since we had coffee this morning, for like, then we went to lunch and and it seems to me that Richard is motivated almost entirely by the desire to be a better person. He wants to know the answers to these questions because he wants to know what it is to be a good person and how you get there. Yeah, so it just kind of, for me, I think that's a very moving tribute to the power of religion to make someone a better person. And I'll just note that there are lots of interesting suggestions you made, which the more disciplinary philosophers listening to the show no doubt want me to pursue about the
Absolutely.
status
Yeah.
of your more theoretical beliefs about
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
metaphysics and the
Yeah.
spiritual realm and all that stuff. But
Hmm.
maybe we'll just have to bracket
Bracket
those for now and
for
set them
the next,
aside.
yeah,
Maybe
rest of our
for
lives to to ponder those things. Yeah.
yeah, like, or maybe someday we'll discuss Xunzi, the third of the great triumvirate
Hmm.
of classical Confucians, who seems to be a person who advocates for religious belief and religious practice, but is also pretty suspicious of supernatural explanations of things. And so that would give us a chance, I think, perhaps to probe a little bit more your own views about the kind of the status of your beliefs about the supernatural or metaphysical. Yeah, so anyway, that's fascinating. My story is far more embarrassing and simplistic or kind of flat-footed. So because I'm sort of, much to my own shame, just not as spiritually enriched as you are. Like I've come to realize at the age of 50 that I just don't have as much of an ear for like spiritual dimensions of life. So here's the story in a nutshell. My parents, they were hippies, not like kind of crazy, like drug using hippies or anything like that. They were more like political or social activist
Hmm.
hippies
Hmm.
in the 70s. And so they wanted to give my sister and me a good spiritual education of a certain kind. And they decided they would try pantheism,
Hmm.
which, I really wish I could just call them up and ask them now to kind of get to clarify exactly what it is that they taught me about God. But as I recall, I was taught that God is in all living things. There is a version of pantheism according to which God is in all things, simpliciter, not just living things, but things, everything. But I think I remember believing as a very, very young child, like 5-year-old, that God is in all living things. And then, according to a story which has since become family lore, we were driving, I think we were on our way back from a camping trip and saw a dead animal on the side of the road. Might have been a deer. And I said, why do some parts of God kill other parts of God? So that was on the Tewald family interpretation, Justin's kind of bringing a sort of pantheistic version of the problem of evil to
Hmm.
bear. So from quite an early age, I became skeptical. Although, as I recall, my early years, what I did was instead of becoming a kind of agnostic or atheist, I developed my own personal theology. And I won't bore you with the details of it, but I'll just kind of, just to give you a glimpse of what it was like. There was a period of time where I thought that Abraham Lincoln was God and that Martin Luther King Jr. was waiting in the wings to take over when Abraham Lincoln retired. So I had this kind of like moral meritocracy view of godhood. I mean, I think a lot of religion actually is motivated by this desire for what I think of as cosmic justice, the
Mm.
view that either the master of the cosmos, like the creator, or, the person who's in charge, or the cosmos itself guarantees that good people get their due rewards and bad people get their due punishments. And for me, that was, as I understood religion, it's not unlike your kind of more moral motivations as well for becoming religious. I thought that was sort of the most important thing was that some sort of cosmic justice be guaranteed. So I saw my personal theology as like a 6 and 7 year old was a kind of moral meritocracy.
Hmm.
But then, just like you, for a while, I became an atheist. And I mean, by high school, I was an atheist. And I think I called myself an agnostic, but then I had a friend who was, this is back before the World Wide Web, who was getting a newsletter for some kind of atheist society. And he convinced me that, in fact, although I called myself an agnostic, I was an atheist because, the evidence that I thought was insufficient to prove one way or another, theism or atheism, actually tells as much in favor of atheism than evidence for any other sort of implausible belief. So he convinced me to call myself an atheist. You say you were an insufferable atheist arguing with your friend. I was a Midwesterner. So I was from, for those of you who are listening outside the United States and not brought up in the US culture, if you're from the so-called Midwest, which is kind of known as the most polite, folksy part of the United States, particularly if you're from the Great Plains, which is like, Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, you're not supposed to be very abrasive. And so you don't bring up sensitive topics that people will argue about. So I would say that maybe in my mind, I was a kind of insufferable atheist. I don't think it really manifested outwardly. But oh man, how much has changed? I mean, I think it was around the age of 40, so about 10 years ago, that I suddenly realized I had really naive views about reasons for belief. And I thought all along that basically only the evidence understood as sort of reasons to believe something is true counted as a good reason for believing something.
Hmm.
But of course, I've met people in my life who, for example, someone who was, a regular attendee of Alcoholics Anonymous, AA,
Hmm.
who said that he needed his religious beliefs in order to have the motivation to resist, the desire to drink.
Hmm.
And I didn't want to deny him that.
That's pretty common, I think, for people in AA. I think that's like
Yeah,
one of the fundamental precepts, something like that, like giving yourself up to a higher power, at least, something like that.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. And, there is all this research now on at least the benefits of having a religious community for well-being and the sense of security. So, basically around the age of 40, my eyes were opened up to a whole realm of sort of reasons for belief that I think of as broadly falling under the purview of what they sometimes call the ethics of belief, kind of
Hmm.
non-evidential, more pragmatic or practical reasons. And then another thing that sort of happened was, well, now I'm really going off the rails. I guess I should stop. But I started thinking more about why it is that in the later Confucian tradition, just about everyone took it as almost as an article of faith or as a starting point that human nature had to be good.
Hmm.
And I realized that it was because they thought if human nature is not good, if if Mencius weren't right about that, then there'd be no hope of becoming virtuous, which is essentially a pragmatic argument. It's not in virtue of the fact that it's actually true that human nature is good that they recommend this belief. They think it's like necessary in order as a kind of for the possibility of becoming good or as a basis for hope or something like that.
Mm.
And
Interesting. Okay.
yeah, so to make a long story short, I'm now so much more kind of open-minded about religion and religious belief. I still struggle because the metaphysics and, of course, the kind of mythology, if I can call it that, strikes me as so implausible,
Hmm.
that I couldn't just sort of will myself to believe them. Just like I can't will myself to believe that
Hmm.
there's a dragon hovering outside the window right now as I look out the window. You know what I mean?
Right.
But
Yeah.
I've really come around to seeing kind of the advantages of, or the reasons why someone would want to be a religious believer and adopt a kind of spiritual life. It's so
Hmm.
complicated. I mean, I still haven't worked out my views entirely. But anyway, I hope that the people, kind of more religious listeners, will therefore not see me so much as one of those obnoxious atheists that apparently we both were, at least in our minds in high school. Yeah.
I think people are a bit less. I mean, there was that whole new atheism movement, which was, I think, more combative than, yeah, or maybe too combative in people's eyes. Over time, I think that movement has kind of declined. Even if people still, maybe the arguments are still good on that side, I think people are more cautious about just simply just condemning wholesale, religious practice because, yeah, I mean, there's these issues of like meaning and purpose that is so fundamental to human life. I mean, we're just such weird creatures. We absolutely need something like that in order to just keep moving forward.
Yes.
And we need that motivation. And it's all practices. One thing I thought of for a long time about with Confucianism is what you also need are like ritualized practice in a kind of institutionalized form so that it can be sustained over time. I mean, one thing that Catholicism does have is there are churches where that happens, every week. And
Mm-hmm.
and so for any religion that is to carry a certain, at least just like even a sociological force just at that level, it probably does need to have like a certain organizations and ways in which the religion can be practiced in community. So yeah, I think that's also extremely important. I
Right.
realized, which is what also gives that social benefit of like a sense of community and friendship and solidarity and so on, which I think every psychologist knows is really important for psychological health. But of course, those are all pragmatic issues. And when I listen to like people like Richard Dawkins, which I actually, although I find him sometimes kind of annoying and irritating, I think he's very smart and I like listening to him still. Yeah, he's just like, yeah, but those are just fairy tales. Like, like, do you really want to just believe in dragons just because you'll feel a little bit happier? I think that would be his response. And I think there's something right about that too. Like, if it really turned out that it's just completely false, to be honest with you, I would say, well, if I thought it was just completely false, I would have to completely abandon it because
Oh, really? Okay.
yeah, I couldn't. Interesting thing is there are people like these pragmatists who say, well,
Yes.
I think Richard Hare, like R.M. Hare, would go to church even though he
Mm-hmm.
did not believe God exists because he
Mm-hmm.
liked singing in the choir. And so, I don't think there's anything inconsistent there, but I don't know. I would, if I really truly believed God did not exist, I don't know if I would pray, for example. I mean, that would be weird. I don't even know. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I can meditate or I can, you know, do
Mm-hmm.
other kinds of maybe spiritual practices, maybe like quiet sitting, like the Neo Confucians or something. But like in terms of prayer, I mean, I don't think that would make sense to ask divine assistance from a being that I don't think exists. I don't find that to be, maybe I'm just too much of a philosopher to have that kind of inconsistent practice or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I mean, if you're looking back at the history of philosophy and religious thought, I mean, you see this pretty well-established pattern of theists or people with religious beliefs who are sort of philosophical about it. First, establishing that the evidence is underdetermined, so like at the very least, they think it's got to be possible that my religious beliefs could be true. And then saying, oh, and then there are these further reasons. I mean, famously, Pascal's wager, like there are
Mm,
good reasons for you to
right.
adopt religious beliefs. In
Yeah.
Pascal's case, because your own salvation, eternal salvation could be at stake.
That's a pragmatic kind of argument. I
Yeah.
remember hating that argument in high school because I remember reading Pascal's wager and I
Yeah.
really disliked it. In fact, I remember my response initially to that argument was, well, then I'll just go to hell because I'm not going to believe for that kind of bad reason, is what I had thought at that time. I'm more sympathetic to it now, maybe in some ways. But yeah, I mean, I remember also like, David Lewis, who's probably the smartest person to ever lived. He says at one point, though, that when it comes to like philosophical arguments and justifications, ultimately, when it comes to the big questions, the fundamental issues, there's no like knockdown argument there. Like people can end up believing
Yeah.
through good reason and go in different directions, even very intelligent people, because he doesn't think that once it's all worked out, like that one argument leads, exactly in one direction over the other.
Yeah.
Especially for the hard, big issues, maybe like consciousness. I'm not sure exactly what specific topics he had in mind, but probably some of
Yeah.
those like long-standing questions.
Yeah. exactly. Or even things like space-time and
Yeah, they're like maybe irresolvable. Maybe it's just beyond the human intellect to fully understand and grasp.
yep.
I think there are such things. And yeah, I don't know. Does that make you a kind of a mystic of some sort of? But that seems right to me that there's going to be things that the human intellect cannot fully make intelligible. So that seems right.
Yeah. Well, I am sorely tempted to continue and now take up a kind of Zhuangzian approach to religion, this sort of double vision approach that we've talked about in the past. But
Hmm.
I suppose we should stick to the topic, and which
Hmm.
is one I'm really looking forward to. So,
Yeah.
not only are we going to discuss this interesting passage where the Kongzi sort of throws down the gauntlet for adhering to ritual tradition, but we're going to discuss a really nice article, fascinating article, kind of deep,
Hmm.
rich, suggestive article by Richard Wollheim on that passage.
Hmm.
So that's what we're going to do after the break. We will see you shortly. Okay, so the passage today, the one that we're going to focus on, is Analects 3:17. And we agreed that Richard would read it shortly. It was actually Richard's suggestion, and Richard also suggested that we pair it with a certain article by Richard Wollheim that I'll mention shortly. It's a short passage, but it's just fascinating because it seems like Kongzi, Confucius, is throwing down the gauntlet for the traditional rituals as they used to be practiced, even when it's no longer the case that people in general accept the ritual or that the accompanying protocols and practices that were meant to be paired with the ritual are no longer practiced. So there's a way of reading this passage to suggest that he's really a kind of strong traditionalist. And maybe that's not the right way of reading it. It's one of the issues that will come up. So let me just start by setting the stage a little bit with respect to this whole idea of ritual as an important theme and value in Confucianism. So what I find is that when I'm teaching Confucian views on ritual, there are at least two general ways of kind of justifying ritual as the Confucians understood those justifications, one of which people sort of grasp pretty easily, and the other is a little bit more difficult. So, one way of justifying rituals, traditional rituals, is as essentially a means of moral cultivation, or maybe more broadly, as a means to other goods. And this is the part that I think everyone can sort of, oftentimes when people, as soon as they hear this idea, even if they don't know much about Confucianism, they can fill in a lot of the details. So you can imagine how rituals, say, of sacrificing to the ancestors or, invocations of the ghosts and spirits or for special favors from heaven, you can see how rituals like that would help cultivate virtues based in respect and gratitude, would help remind you of your debts to your ancestors, for example, or teach you to respect others. So those are the more sort of instrumentalist justifications of Confucian rituals. But there's this other sense that appears in the text that rituals themselves are constitutive of the good life or of living in accordance with the way. Sometimes it seems like what it means to be good or humane, to have this master virtue of Ren, sometimes translated as humaneness or goodness, just is to be observant of the rituals, to be kind of a skillful, reverent, respectful performer of rituals. Analects 12:1 is one passage that comes to mind. It's often cited as evidence for this sort of view. I can think of an article by Kwang Lai Shun, I'll put in the show notes, where he cites a bunch of passages that sort of articulate what he calls the definitionalist view of Ren or goodness, according to which just performing rituals is part of the definition of being good. So this idea that somehow performing rituals well and respectfully is itself a final good, or as we sometimes say, intrinsic good, is harder to grasp. It's harder to articulate. The idea seems to be something like, well, one way of spelling it out, and many ways we could do it, but one way of spelling it out is just to say that rituals, especially understood as social practices, where there's a shared understanding of their their significance, and their meaning. And there's a shared appreciation of the artistry in performing them. Those rituals, they give our lives meaning in a way, right? They give them social meaning. They help link up our personal individual practices, our ceremonious performances with a tradition, which somehow gives it meaning, and with a culture, with a community, and perhaps with some sort of objective basis that makes them valuable or confers value upon them, maybe. So that idea that somehow performing rituals well is something that gives life meaning is captured rather well in a very memorable, powerful, suggestive, difficult lecture by one of the very more interesting philosophers of the 20th century, Richard Wollheim. And Richard suggested that we read his article, which was really just a lecture called The Sheep and the Ceremony, which is all about Analects 317. And so we're going to discuss that article. I'm not going to read it, but we're going to discuss it when we see opportunities to do so. For the record, it's part of a longer book by him, a collection of essays called The Mind and Its Depths. But before we get to Richard Wollheim or any of that stuff, we should look at the passage itself, Analects 317.
Okay, great. So I'm going to read this passage. This is the Edward Slingerland passage of 317 of the Analects. It goes, Zigong wanted to do away with the practice of sacrificing a lamb to announce the beginning of the month. The master said, Zigong, you regret the loss of the lamb, whereas I regret the loss of the right.
Right. So, yeah. Actually, this passage is often quoted. That particular line, you regret the loss of the lamb, or you care about the loss of the lamb, whereas I care about the loss of the right. It's often mentioned, often quoted. So let me provide you with a little bit of context as best I can. As usual, I looked at the commentaries. This time I have to say, because I'm so pressed, it's the middle of grading season, I kind of just looked at them quickly. But here's my sense. There's a lot of agreement that basically what's happened is something like this. There was a traditional ritual, which most of the commentators say is traceable back to King Wen or Duke Wen, one of the founders of the Zhou dynasty, which played an important role in the politics or governance of the state. And that ritual has been more or less kept alive, but in a hollowed out form, in a kind of mostly symbolic or tokenistic form, in the state of Lu, where Hongzi lived, and his home state. So the way we should think of it, according to the traditional commentators, is something like the following. Once, there was a whole package of rituals and state protocols, of which the lamb sacrifice was sort of the most important part, kind of most powerful or evocative part, symbolic part. But the package included lots of things that have to do with good governance. Now, in some versions of this package, there was like a kind of calendar that was shared by the ruler with all of the lesser officials and feudal lords, so that everyone understood that when certain important ceremonies of state and state functions, were supposed to take place, it served as a kind of coordinating function. Everyone recognized at the beginning of the month that they were all on the same calendar, right, as the ruler, and they had to follow the same calendar and thus follow the same sort of timeline for important functions of government. That's one version. Another version says that the ruler himself wasn't actually all that involved in the day-to-day management of the empire. So he would have at the beginning of this month a kind of check-in, a gathering with the other lesser lords and other sort of bureaucratic subordinates to make sure that he was aware of all the problems that they were facing. Maybe there were problems that only he could solve because it was sort of beyond the purview of their individual offices to solve them. It required some coordination from above, as it were. Anyway, the point is, although we don't know exactly what the larger package consisted of, most commentators agree that there was a larger package of rituals, ceremonies, and state protocols, of which the lamb sacrifice was the most important part. And it seems that what was happening by the time we get to this moment in the life of Kongzi and his disciple Zigong is that the rest of the package had been abandoned. And now all that was left was this kind of residual, maybe seemingly purely tokenistic or symbolic lamb sacrifice that just some stodgy old traditionalists insisted on performing. So Zigong, being a young person and, obviously sometimes willing to recognize when resources are being wasted that the traditionalists are reluctant to fess up to or admit to, seems to be saying, look, this is a waste of resources. You're killing a lamb every month and no one seems to even care. And, this ritual was embedded in a series of other practices that are no longer adhered to or observed. So why even bother continuing? And the master says, famously, well, that's because you care so much about the loss of the lamb. Whereas what I care about or what I regret is the loss of the right itself. Yeah, so there's a lot to say here. It seems like Kongzi believes at least it's regrettable that this important ritual ceremony of state or package of ceremonies of state that go back in time to the founding of the dynasty are being lost. Arguably, he's also saying that the lamb sacrifice, even though it's just symbolic at this point, even though the kind of package of rituals have been hollowed out and it's left with this kind of residual symbolic part, should continue. So all of the traditional commentators suggest Confucius thinks the lamb sacrifice should continue. That's how they read the passage. So, for example, Jushi suggests, well, even though the substance of the package of rituals are no longer observed, at least we still have the form, and the form keeps the memory alive. So there's still some hope of reviving the cluster or constellation of rituals that it was once a part of. So anyway, that's the passage.
Right. And I did wonder about this alternative reading where, because what Confucius actually says is, well, Zigong, you regret the loss of the lamb, whereas I regret the loss of the right. And so if he's referring to the right as the original right, the whole package deal,
yeah,
then what he might be saying isn't necessarily that Zigong is wrong to want to do away with the lamb sacrifice, because maybe Zigong is right. Like, the original ritual has been hollowed out, as you put it, and it no longer makes sense anymore. It doesn't preserve the original intent and doesn't serve the proper aims that used to be good. And so what he's saying is, yeah, well, you care about the loss of the lamb, but I'm so sad that original ritual is no longer present with us. So it seems like that's at least one possible reading. Or I wonder if there's any reason to think that's not what Confucius might have had in mind, in which case he's not necessarily disagreeing with Zigong, although he is still kind of criticizing Zigong in that he thinks Zigong is not maybe focused on the right thing. I mean, which might still trouble modern readers, like, oh, but the lamb slaughter, that's so bad. But I guess Confucius thinks really like he's homing in on the right. I mean, he really definitely cherishes these classic rituals. He definitely thinks that they're extremely important. And so I think at the very minimum, we can still interpret him as thinking that, well, no, we should still be focused on preserving the rights. Although maybe he would say, unfortunately, that original right is no longer with us. And so, yeah, maybe the lamb sacrifice doesn't make sense anymore. What do you think, Justin? Is that a possible reading here?
Yeah. That's a really creative reading. I have to say, I can't think of a commentator. I didn't do a very careful reading of the commentaries, but I guess I just uncritically assumed the more traditional reading of the passage, according to which Kongzi wants to keep even the vestigial version of the ritual alive. But yes, actually, it's defensible, your reading, which is to say that like maybe Kongzi realizes that given that it's now no longer serving a real function, that lamb sacrifice no longer is embedded in that set of state protocols and rituals that once really made it useful and valuable. Maybe he sees it as going away and he's just saying, I myself regard that as regrettable, whereas you seem to think the only thing regrettable about the whole thing is just that we've been wasting all these lambs.
Right. Yeah. He's still criticizing Zigong. You're not appreciating the ritual. And at the least, Confucius would be okay with the lamb sacrifice, certainly, if it was, even on this reading, embedded within the broader context that was still serving that broader end. So I think he's not against sacrificing the lamb or the sheep within that original ritual. So I guess we could still, wonder about that anyways. And if that's problematic still. So this question can still be raised.
Yes. Yeah, there's another interesting interpretive issue here, which has to do with how much kind of a shared practice or a shared understanding is required in order to partake of or instantiate distinctive values that we think rituals are meant to instantiate. Richard Wollheim, who wrote this article that we mentioned earlier, he is, of course, talking about it in the 20th century, and the lamb sacrifice and whatever set of rituals it belonged to are long dead. He says, okay, I myself don't think that if I were to go out in the wilderness and kill a lamb and bring it to a ceremony, that would have any particular value or meaning whatsoever. So he doesn't think the value of the ritual stands alone. It always, it only gets its distinctive kind of value, final value or intrinsic value by having a shared understanding and a shared practice, So you have to belong to a society where people see this as a really important thing to provide a lamb. If you're the head of state, if you're the head of government, ruler, and you're providing a lamb to your subordinates and having this grand meeting where you hear out their grievances and try to solve problems and show your concern for their challenges as kind of like lesser officials, that ceremony, when done well, has a great deal of meaning. And the lamb perhaps means a lot to people under those special circumstances. But if you don't have shared practice, if there isn't the kind of cultural value and understanding that sharing a lamb with your kind of bureaucratic subordinates at the beginning of the month has this meaning, then yeah, there's no particular reason to do it. And so then that then raises the question, another interpretive question, which is Kongzi, does he want to keep the kind of hollowed out version of the ritual alive simply because that's the only way there will be any hope perhaps of one day reviving it? Like he wants to keep the memory alive so that maybe he wants to keep it as a kind of a as an IOU or as a marker of place so that someday maybe when you have a more ambitious ruler who's more committed to the traditional rituals, he'll say, "Ah, yes, yes, there is this lamb sacrificing that we do at the beginning of the month. We should finally, I don't know, look up the records of the founding of the state of Zhou and figure out what was meant to accompany that ritual." That's one interpretation, which I think is essentially Zhu Xi's interpretation, and a pretty common one, I have to say, among the commentators, the traditional commentators. But is there a way of reading the passage so that, like, even the symbolic vestigial version of the ritual, without all the accompanying protocols, has some intrinsic value or final value itself? You know, like the commentators don't seem to think so, actually, I have to say. They seem to present it as like, oh, just the traditionalists are still sacrificing the lamb, and a lot of like more sensible, I don't know, I imagine sort of pragmatic political figures like Zegong see it as kind of laughable that they're still doing it. Yeah, I'm just
Right,
curious.
wrench from the original context.
Yeah.
It's worth noting, Wollheim, what he's doing in that paper is he's trying to provide a way of understanding ritual that possibly at least preserves the idea that these rituals have intrinsic value and are constitutive of a good human life in some way by analogizing it with art. So he thinks that, well, a lot of more people think art has intrinsic value and that we might wonder how or why. So he actually provides a very complicated and challenging discourse about how art does carry intrinsic value. And as far as I understood it, Justin, and you can maybe add or correct me if you think not quite right on this, but well, first of all, the process is intrinsically valuable when the artist works through to create this product. But also, art elicits certain fundamental human emotions, and that's in itself has expressive value, which I guess he thinks has a kind of intrinsic value. And so, in the same way, when people are practicing the ritual, so this is how I understood it. So, when you're engaging in the ritual, including, let's say, the lamb sacrifice, maybe there are certain fundamental human emotions that are being expressed in a unique way within that context of the ritual, which itself is kind of like a musical performance. It has intrinsic value just in the very fact of its expression. So maybe like here, I might think of emotions like awe or wonder or maybe gratitude or something like that, or a sense of our fragility. I can imagine that, right? The slaughtering of the lamb, like it helps you to express your emotion of fragility or sense of mortality or something. And in the face of like your own death. And so there's a kind of awe and wonder mixed up with it. And so anyways, I don't think Wollheim really even knows, and he's not pretending to identify the specific kind of emotion or justification for the sheep sacrifice. But he thinks that insofar as they are properly eliciting these basic emotions and are expressing them, they can have a like a unique place within the context of a human life. And so what he's also saying is we might, you know, from a modern perspective, because we're not as like embedded in rituals of this kind, we just go, well, yeah, the sheep, we tend to be more, I guess, sympathetic to animal death, maybe more so than back in the day, although I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, I think we might be. We do a kind of utilitarian calculus, and we're just like, whoa, like the pain of the suffering or pain or suffering of the sheep obviously outweighs whatever good feelings the ritual produced. And so it seems unjust, also maybe just inherently so, because we're slaughtering a living creature. And so the game is over. Like obviously it's a bad practice. And I think Wollheim wants to make a more of a case for this kind of ritual. And I should also know one more thing. I think this was even more the case when he was working as a philosopher. And I'm not sure the exact timeline. I think it's
mid to late 20th century.
Yeah, like 50s, when they're doing a lot of semantic work and they're building up very sophisticated, elaborate moral theories. And so I think he thinks that a lot of moral theorizing and moral philosophy was getting detached from human practice, from human psychology.
Yeah.
And so he has this wonderful line where he says something like, some people think of morality as that point at which we move or where we detach ourselves from human nature. And he thinks that that's a kind of dreamland, a kind of fantasy. And then he makes this remark at the very end of the paper saying that dreamland is occupied by a lot of moral philosophers or something like
Yeah,
that.
that's right.
And I think this is like in the spirit of like people like Owen Flanagan, but also like Alistair McIntyre thinks morality is socially embodied within history, within culture. And so that's why we need to have a deeper understanding of culture, society, anthropology, and also psychology. I think Wollheim seems very big on that because he brings up Freud and just the depth of our human unconsciousness and human thought. And so I thought he did a really cool job of kind of connecting ritual with these like other deeper elements of the human psyche. So I really
Oh, yeah.
enjoyed that aspect.
Yeah, that's right. It's amazing. I was watching Richard. He was sort of just looking up, trying to recall all this passages in the essay from memory. Well, I had the luxury of actually looking up the essay and looking at the text itself. So this lecture it's a named lecture. So it's in honor of someone named Sir Leslie Stephen. I don't know anything about this lecture series. I bet it was at Cambridge. So anyway, he says in one of his finest essays, Sir Leslie Stephen, who's after whom this lecture series is named, devised a name for the home of such beliefs. He called it the world of dreams, dreamland. And then his closing sentence is, dreamland is crowded with moral philosophers. So yes, he thinks that
Okay, crowded with moral philosophers. Yeah.
he thinks that this kind of a priori way of doing moral philosophy, where morality is sort of defined in such a way that it can't somehow take account of contingent features of human psychology and human nature, is deeply problematic. And that's one of the cool things about Richard Wollheim is he's willing to take on a lot of the contingency and yet still come up with a really rich and interesting moral worldview. So yeah, there's a lot that you said there, Richard. To kind of focus on this one issue I had, which was, is there some intrinsic or final value in continuing to practice the vestigial version of sacrificing the lamb, even though the ritual's been hollowed out and it's not accompanied by all the other important ceremonies and expectations? I think perhaps there is a case to be made for that view, that it's still of some value. And we can make that case by just thinking a little bit more about what it is that makes the good practice of a ritual intrinsically valuable. So here's some examples that we could work with. I mean, let's go with the version that we see in the one commentary, the Xing Bing commentary, according to which the beginning of the month is a time when the ruler calls together all of his subordinates and kind of gets a chance to show his concern for them and their work, you know? And so here's them out, solves problems, and also shows his appreciation for their work by providing them with this lamb, this sacrificial lamb. So now imagine that the ruler is living at a time where none of the lesser officials, none of the feudal lords or lesser political officials like ministers even see the lamb as like a meaningful thing, and they don't care, and they don't see it as obligating them in return to like perform certain functions of state on a certain timeline. So it doesn't mean anything to anyone anymore, but he still does it, right? I think there's still a case to be said that, I mean, given the kind of history of the ritual and the tradition, there's still a case to be made that there's something worthy and admirable in the ruler's behavior in continuing to observe this rite, even if it doesn't mean all that much to other people, so long as they at least understand what it's meant to mean, if that makes any sense, what it's intended to mean. I think it's also just sort of helpful to think about ceremonial expressions of respect in general when they're no longer serving a practical purpose. So another passage that always strikes me as really, really actually quite effective at displaying the potential intrinsic value of rituals, especially the value of using rituals to express respect, is Analects 10:20, which says essentially, when Kongzi was summoned by his lord, when Confucius was summoned by his lord, his ruler, he would set off on foot without waiting for his horses to be hitched to the carriage. And so Analects 10:20 is a passage that appears in Book 10, which is basically a series of descriptions of Kongzi's ritually correct behavior. This, by the way, is also the source of that passage about how Kongzi wouldn't sit on his mat unless it was straight. That's 10:12. But anyway, and also the one about the stables they catch fire. He rushes over and asks, were any people hurt? He doesn't ask about the expensive horses. Anyway, so in 10:20, it's really interesting. It basically says when he receives the summons from his ruler, he immediately leaves. He immediately goes out the door and starts walking towards the ruler. Now, what I'm imagining is that, like, his assistants, his attendants are now quickly hooking up the horses to the carriage or to the chariot and then catching up with him. And then he gets on board and still makes it to the ruler's place, essentially at the same time, you know. So in terms of like his punctuality, it makes no difference whatsoever. But just symbolically, it does make a difference, right? I mean, imagine that like you, Richard, receive some really, really important announcement, you know, or summons or something. I don't know. You've been called to meet a really important official, or, you know, you've been announced that you're going to receive some Nobel Prize or something. And your first reaction is to say, oh, well, that's really great. But unfortunately, at the moment, there's nothing I can do about it. So I'm just going to sit here and watch YouTube videos or, you know, like TikTok or something
Mm-hmm.
until I officially get the phone call or something. It just somehow seems like less respectful and therefore sort of intrinsically a kind of loss of value. Like, you know, and so I don't know, maybe other people's intuitions push in a different direction, but I really appreciate the fact that Kongzi saw the importance of setting off on foot right away when his ruler summoned him as an expression
Mm-hmm.
of value. That he didn't want to just like put up his feet and twiddle his thumbs while waiting for the servants to hook up the
Yeah.
carriage to the horses.
Yeah,
And
it's how you respond and the form that itself has value also, not just maximizing the speed at which you arrive there now. And
yeah,
yeah, I think that's right. And if you just think of everything as only valuable for the sake of some further end and instrumentalize everything like in that spirit, then you might start wondering where's the intrinsic value, right? No,
yeah,
it's
right.
right then and there, the way he responded with those feelings, with that attitude of respect, that right there, that little gesture was what was valuable and so important. And
Yeah,
I think Confucius was all over, or that aspect of human life and why it's so crucial to get those things right, the form.
right. I mean, there's a way of reading the tradition that comes down to us from Kongzi as more or less recommending that we practice ritual. And oftentimes, if you read the old texts, especially the Analects, but also the Li Ji, this other kind of traditional ritual text, canonical Confucian text, they often recommend that you perform rituals with a sense that they characterize with the Chinese character jing, which is often translated as respect or
Mhm.
reverence. It seems to be really important to them that you practice the rituals reverentially or respectfully. And it might be that one of the reasons we're supposed to do that, we're supposed to practice rituals respectfully or reverentially, is because it attunes us to a dimension of value that is otherwise easy to ignore precisely because we so habitually instrumentalize, right? So we
Mhm.
so habitually wonder, well, what's the actual cash value, so to speak, of this activity that I'm performing? And that makes you think in terms of like some further good that's somehow less controversially good, like, I don't know, pleasure or you know,
Mhm.
having a full stomach or what have you, you know, like creature comforts. And so it could be that practicing the ritual tradition respectfully or reverentially is supposed to just alert you to or attune you to these other sorts of values, inherent or intrinsic or final values that are easy to ignore precisely because of that instrumentalizing brain or mind that we have, that kind of have of instrumentalizing goods that makes us
Mhm.
ignore these subtler values.
Yeah, we do tend to justify actions and practices by appealing to certain further goals. But if you think about, why is it important to show up at the funeral of a good friend, and pay your respect, as we say? I mean,
Yeah.
is it that it will benefit your dead friend? No, not really. And maybe you think, oh, but the family will appreciate it. But maybe that's not even really that true because it's a big crowd. But just
Yeah.
the fact that you went, you took the time, you made the effort. Yeah, we might just think that itself is what's important and not the further end of, oh, well, there's maybe greater social harmony, which maybe there's some truth to it too. But that's not all
Yes.
that there is. It's the very action activity itself that has this, I think sometimes people call it atelic or like, yeah,
Yeah.
non instrumental value.
Yes. Yeah, for me, that's a powerful example. I think of the people I've really loved and cherished and lost. And in some cases, you know, in one case, for example, my best friend from high school, when he passed away, I didn't even know about his funeral. Unfortunately, he lost much of his family, so the news wasn't shared widely. And what I regret about it is not that I lost my chance to show my support for the surviving members of his family, which was just his sister, really, but just that I didn't get a chance to express my grief and appreciation for him because he had such a profound influence on me growing up. So, yeah, to me, I think it's right. It really is a loss that I wasn't able to express my appreciation and respect for that
Hmm.
friend. And
Hmm.
independently of any other value that might have been realized by attending the funeral. Yeah, that's
Yeah, or like honoring someone's wishes after they're dead, even like their will.
yes,
Like maybe you might
yes,
think philosophers come up with all kinds of clever examples, right? Oh, maybe you can use the money or the will, like redirect it in a way where it serves even more value, right? Or like, maybe there's even greater utility. But there's also something to this thought that, well, no, you should honor what the person's wishes, right? Like there's value to that. It's a kind of inherent value. It's not because the person's dead and will not find out, right?
yeah,
Yeah, but why do we have these practices? It's an interesting question, and I don't know if I have a better answer than, well, these are, yeah, I'm not sure actually. How would you explain that? It does seem like it's right to honor someone's wishes, even someone who passed away. Yeah, maybe because, yeah,
yeah,
you still owe them respect. Yeah, maybe it's just fundamental in that way.
yeah. There are a number of ways of doing it, but I think one of the more promising avenues is the one that you suggested, the sort of expressive value of properly showing your respect. There's just something about, independently of its consequences, showing your respect for people who were dear to you, to whom you feel a kind of indebtedness or gratitude, and or who you appreciate or something, whose lives you appreciate.
Yeah. I did also want to quickly bring up, so because we're talking about Confucian ritual, and when I do teach the Analects, one of the first things I do bring up is, the greeting ritual, and Herbert Fingeret, of course, made this
Yeah,
example kind of prominent about just like handshake and how much goes into it actually. Like, because
yeah,
if there's not that practice, like, and you don't understand some of the basic rules of a handshake, because we've all had bad handshakes, right? But what's so powerful about that ritual is such a simple little gesture. And you can imagine like a young person going, does it really matter? It's just like, it's just a simple little hi or whatever. But
yeah,
actually, it's way more powerful than that. It shows a sense of respect to the person. And we are like, human beings are so aware and socially sensitive to those things. And I tell my students, like, have you ever had
yeah.
someone that pretend not to know you or just walk past you?
Yes, that's a
And
good example.
and
Yeah,
that could weigh on you for like weeks. Like, like a friend that just you say hi to and they just brush past you, brush you off or
yeah,
whatever. It's unbelievably damaging sometimes. And yet you might just go, well, what's the big deal? It was just a little wave or a little smile or
yeah,
acknowledgement. But that simple thing has so much power. So I think
yeah.
Confucius really understood that, and which is why I think some of those teachings are still very much alive.
Yeah, that is a good example. And just to fill listeners in, Richard is referring to Herbert Fingeret. Its last name is spelled Fingarettete. And he wrote this book, Confucius, the Secular as Sacred. I would say in the English-speaking world, one of the most important books insofar as it inspired a number of philosophers in the English-speaking world anyway to take Confucius seriously as a philosopher.
I think there are some criticisms that
Oh
have come
yeah.
to find valid, like there's a kind of behaviorism. There's some
Oh,
things that seems
absolutely. The
yeah,
behaviorism. Yeah,
uh,
it's really pronounced. Yeah.
yeah. So that I wouldn't accept. But the way he explained some of these rituals, especially in that first chapter of that book, I thought was so compelling and so well done. I think it
Yeah.
really showcased the power of some of Confucius's ideas.
Yeah. Another thing you said, Richard, I thought was really helpful was you reminded us of this rather long, extensive analogy that Richard Wollheim draws between the intrinsic, sort of expressive value of performing a ritual well and the expressive value of doing artwork well. I suppose we can imagine playing a piece of music or maybe doing a painting. He gives lots of examples from the world of painting without actually naming the paintings, but you get the sense he has Monet and Van Gogh. And anyway, that analogy is really interesting to me. And because I must confess, I'm not conversant in this world for a long time now. People who, at least in the 20th century, who wrote on philosophy and were interested in art would write really movingly about the philosophy of art. They started using abstract terms to describe the process and the dimensions of value of the artwork, which in ways that I, in fact, can't really track. So I just entirely grasp how the metaphor was supposed to work. I feel like you did a better job of describing it than I did. There's another dimension of the metaphor, which I think is really interesting, will probably be interesting to our listeners, which has to do with the degree to which rituals as shared cultural practices have value conferred upon them by the people who invest meaning in them, people who sort of see the rituals as having some significance to them, the people who think that the lamb sacrifice, the subordinates of the ruler, for example, think that the lamb sacrifice is a nice gesture from their ruler, as opposed to other people who just think it's kind of gross and weird. So there's this issue, essentially, which you could characterize in a number of different ways. I mean, you could just very roughly describe it as kind of the subjective or objective bases for value of performance of ritual. But he characterizes it as in terms of what he calls voluntarism and realism or objectivism. I think he uses those two terms sort of
Hmm.
interchangeably.
Hmm.
So voluntarism is the view that the proper performance of the ritual has value in virtue of the fact that people invest it with value. Essentially, they regard it as valuable. They desire it. They see it as a good way to show your respect, for example.
Hmm.
And then objectivism or realism says, no, no, there are features of the world or, maybe metaphysical features in virtue of which this is the right way to show your respect, or in virtue of which this is a good expression of your respect or reverence. So he wants to say that he's neither a strict voluntarist about this particular issue, nor a strict realist/subjectivist. And we know that he's not a strict objectivist because he says, if I were to go out in the wilderness and find a lamb and kill it, that would have, in this day and age where it means nothing to no one that I do so, that would have no particular value. It would just be a weird kind of gross, mean, maybe sadistic thing to do. So he's a voluntarist to that respect. He thinks that some kind of shared understanding and interest in the ritual is required. But he also thinks that voluntarism, in some sense, doesn't have any legs. It can't go very far because he thinks in order for us to find meaning or significance in a ritual, we do have to be able to give some sort of explanation. And he says, in a sort of hand-wavy way, which is to say, he doesn't really explain why in any detail. But he says voluntarism just doesn't admit of those sorts of explanations. It doesn't allow us to give those kinds of explanations. I can imagine some voluntarists sort of pushing back. So then he goes on to say, this is where the expressive value of art can help us, because there are both objective and sort of voluntaristic or subjective dimensions of good art. And he tries to give this example, which he says, for example, one thing that makes an artwork as opposed to just an object of nature is just kind of a natural phenomenon, is that the artist is trying to do something, is trying to express something with it. And so as soon as they establish that intention, they're already establishing, I think he wants to say, success criteria when they establish an intention, right? Like,
Hmm.
and there are so-called objective features of the world, or maybe we should say intersubjective features, I'm not sure, in virtue of which the art does or doesn't succeed at expressing it. Giving some examples of like how you come to see certain paintings or scenes as melancholic as,
Hmm.
and you can be successful or not so successful in that. And that's not just entirely up to your intention. But at the same time, the artist's intention is a necessary component of the artwork. And part of what we do when we interpret whether the artwork is good or not, or successful or not, beautiful or not,
Hmm.
is evaluate it in terms of whether it realizes the intention of the artist. And he wants to say something similar is true of good performances of ritual. The intention matters. It matters whether, I guess, when someone's performing a ritual, they're trying to show respect and reverence, or whether they're just going through the motions or, I don't know,
Hmm.
following orders or something. But there are also facts about the performance of the ceremony beyond just what the performer intends that matter too, in terms of whether it's a good performance or not.
Hmm. Yeah, I found that discussion extremely interesting. Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, objectivism or realism, you could be an objectivist and think, say, like friendship or loving relationships are objectively good for humans, right? But if you think about friendship, it does also require certain mental states and desires, right? For a relationship to be one of friendship, you need both people to, for example, care about the other. So there's
Hmm.
a sense in which you can have an objectivism, but the specific good requires the existence of certain psychological states.
Yes.
But that would not make it necessarily subjective, even though
Yes.
there's a subjective element. So that's why I wasn't entirely sure if Wollheim's view could still be spelled out as objectivist, because
Yes.
yeah, I guess it gets kind of confusing and we don't have to go into too many details about that. But yeah.
No, no, I agree. It's Richard's pointing to this kind of really contested issue in some of the literature on realism about value, subjectivism, objectivism. Sometimes when people are arguing about whether value is ultimately reducible just to subjective states or subjective attitudes, they talk about subjectivity in terms of what they call mind dependence.
Hmm.
So if it turns out that a value is mind dependent, that's supposed to be problematic in the eyes of certain realists and objectivists, but not so much for people who embrace subjectivism. But then, as Richard's pointing out, there are cases where we have values that seem to be mind dependent, and yet it seems kind of wrong to describe them as subjective. So, like a lot of people, so called objective list theorists about well being, put friendship on the list of objective goods. They say it's a good thing for people to have friendship in their lives. And yet it does seem mind dependent in some sense. I mean, I think we could just do a little bit of work and start to see that there are lots of different senses of mind dependence at stake here. But yeah, there's no point in pursuing a friendship if, in fact, it's not possible for both of you to have friendly attitudes towards each other if you're just kind of going through the motions or something.
Or
Yeah.
hedonism, I mean, which is like the view that pleasure is the only thing that is good. I mean, it's weird because sometimes you might think of that as a subjectivist view, but then you might think it's also like an objectivist account. There's just one thing that's objectively valuable, which is pleasure, but it's just a certain specific mental state or
Yeah.
a psychological phenomenon.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose one way of doing it is to say whether it gets enumerated as being on the list of objective goods or not is not up to your own subjective attitudes, but as whether you instantiate it or not is up to your own subjective attitudes. Anyway, maybe we're going too far into the weeds. I can imagine a number of ways of running with this debate, but I guess it's still worth pointing out that Wollheim very helpfully uses this analogy to artistic expression to help us capture certain dimensions that might otherwise seem, I don't know if I want to say problematic, well, both problematic and hard to wrap our minds around in explaining what's valuable about performing a ritual well. And he describes, by the way, in this lecture, he was just reading the Analects on a train when he read this passage. And it just moved him so much, he found himself thinking about it for years. He wrote this lecture precisely because he wanted to do justice to this idea that he found in the Analects, that there is something deeply regrettable about giving up even the vestigial version of this ritual, like giving up the sacrifice of the lamb.
There's something profound about this. And of course, Justin, you're a good, thoughtful vegetarian. And so,
Right.
but you can kind of appreciate it though still, right? This kind of,
yes, absolutely.
Sheep slaughter sacrifice. I mean, and I think Wollheim really does a great job of kind of alerting us to those aspects of ritual that I think might go unnoticed from a more of a kind of calculative or kind of a bit more of a simpler utilitarian way of understanding value. I think he's drawing attention to, more of these intrinsic features of these really profound human goods. Like, I guess art, I guess music would be another one too, right? Like a musical performance, right? Okay, so you go to a symphony and someone might go, oh, but what happens after the symphony? What do you get out of it? You might just go, well, no, it was the symphony that you participated in where you listened to the performance. That is what was amazing and beautiful.
Yes.
That was the value, not that you're looking forward to some further thing that happens after the symphony's over, like some rush of feeling or something.
Yeah. And one of the things that often happens, I've noticed in both writing and especially teaching these materials, is it's easy to get confused because oftentimes one and the same instance of a good thing will have both instrumental and non-instrumental value.
Yes.
And maybe that habit I mentioned earlier, the habit of the mind to always look for instrumentalist ways of justifying certain activities, it might be a byproduct of the fact that it's, like that most goods actually do come as a kind of package deal with both instrumental and intrinsic value, or instrumental and final value. And because of that, I don't know, somehow the intelligibility of the instrumental values kind of crowds out our ability to appreciate the final value.
I mean, when you're growing up, those rules are often taught, like moral rules or reasons to like be truthful and be kind, often is taught in an instrumentalist way, right? Like, oh, what if, then people won't like you, if you act like that, or if you lie, you'll get caught and, you'll get punished. And so you kind of begin already on more of an instrumentalist track, it seems. You don't go like Kantian, like, well, you got to respect people, know, in and of themselves or something like that. I mean, it's just, you're not going to tell that to a 6-year-old.
Yeah, that's another good hypothesis, actually. Rousseau's Emile, which is this book by Rousseau, where he kind of describes, he almost hypothesizes this raising of a young child from an early age, sort of in a state of nature away from civilization, so as to make them a kind of more perfect human being. And one of the things he says is that kids at a certain age just don't understand any other rationale, except for like, if you do it this way, you won't be punished. If you do it the other way, you will be punished, you know? So it could
Yeah.
be that like the way we learn to sort of understand what makes something good or not good is primarily instrumental at first. And for that reason, we tend to see later in life when we're trying to justify goods to ourselves, we see them as in terms of instrumental value.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what Santa Claus is built on because, yeah, as we speak, Christmas is coming up. And,
Yeah.
but I think it's so important to recognize the intrinsic values and realize that aspect of human life. It just seems such an important part of a good human life.
Yeah.
I'm always racking my brains to see, like, to figure out how best to impart that for my own kids, like the value of like beauty and literature and good art and,
Yeah.
friendship and love. I mean, how, and the virtues, I mean, because I always worry about instrumentalization, like, that they kind
Yeah.
of, that's the mindset that often gets produced. And I think I sometimes support that as well in the way I kind of teach them these things, and,
Yeah.
but it's so easy.
Yeah. On this point, it's worth mentioning that this later Neo-Confucian philosopher that we have often talked about, Zhu Xi, Zhuxi, is a really interesting reader of the Analects in this respect, because I mentioned earlier that the classical Confucian texts often connect ritual and proper performance with ritual with this attitude that they call jing, sometimes translated as reverence or reverential attention. For Zhu Xi, I think it basically has to be reverential attention. It's his kind of Confucian adaptation of Buddhist mindfulness, where you take this sort of awareness of the present moment that sets aside concerns about the fruits, the value that will come of your activity in the future, the kind of payoff. It's just focusing on the present, compared with what he considers to be a distinctively Confucian sense of appreciation of value that he thinks the Buddhists lack. And so it seems like Zhu Xi's basically reading rituals as teaching us to kind of really embody and quickly access and kind of more easily access this special attitude that he calls reverential attention or jing, which does attune us to things that have intrinsic value, whose value doesn't depend upon the fruits that they will bring us later. So yeah, it kind of fits rather well with the view that you've been pushing, Richard.
Well, okay. I'm happy to be in collaboration with Zhu Xi, one of the
Yeah.
greatest thinkers in Chinese history. So I'll take
Yeah,
that.
right.
And
Seconded by Zhu Xi, or you're seconding Zhu Xi, maybe. Yeah, right. Yeah.
yeah, no, I couldn't hold a candle to Zhu Xi. But yeah, so that's great. Yeah, so I think we've covered quite a bit.
Maybe that covers it. Maybe as a closing thought, I'll say I'm so glad that we had a chance finally to talk about ritual and Confucianism, since we've been running this series for almost a year now. And it's really one of the most important themes. And as two professional philosophers, we might not have emphasized it enough. Now finally
I think we'll have to talk about it more. I actually have come to think or appreciate ritual more the more I've taught it to my
Yes.
students, the more I thought about it. And I have the slogan, life is ritual. I teach that to my students and just
Yeah.
helping them to see how much of life, is ritualized practice and why it's so crucial for having a good life. And I think they actually appreciate that. We didn't really talk about habits and cultivation as much. I think you kind of touched upon
Yes.
it a few times, but that's also really an important part of this whole picture, I think, as well.
Yes, absolutely. Right. So we will follow up. There are so many other dimensions of ritual to discuss. And ritual in the Confucian sense is a broad term. So I think actually this idea of life as ritual is quite Confucian sentiment that you've expressed. This reminds me, we still haven't actually devoted a whole episode to Xunzi, the third of the great triumvirate of Confucian philosophers and the great ritual theorist, far and away the most interesting ritual theorist, one of the most interesting ritual theorists in history. So perhaps that will be our next excuse to talk about ritual. So with that, I guess we'll call it a wrap for today and say that was the way for today. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.